Hello and welcome to India Speak, podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I am Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at CPR. You are listening to our special series titled Spotlight South Asia that brings together leading experts from India's neighborhood to understand the events in these countries, whether political, economic, or social, but from a domestic perspective. The country featured today is Nepal, and my guest is Amish Raj Mulmi. Amish Raj Mulmi is an editor and writer based out of Kathmandu in Nepal. His first book, All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, was published last year with great acclaim. He has been a columnist with the Kathmandu Post since 2018, and his essays and features have appeared in Al Jazeera, Hindustan Times, Roads and Kingdoms, National Geographic Traveler, Himal South Asia, Mint Lounge, and at many other places. Amish, welcome to Spotlight South Asia.
Thank you, Sushant, for having me over. It's a pleasure.
To begin with, Amish, we hear a lot about the precarious economic situation in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and in Pakistan. But what is the economic condition in Nepal right now? How does the economy look like after 2 years of pandemic? Has tourism, which is one of the big sectors in Nepal, has it picked up? Have remittances from external workers gone up again?
It's still, the situation is still not comparable to Sri Lanka, but there are some worrying indicators that we are seeing now. Foreign exchange reserves are declining. Our import costs are shooting up tremendously. We are facing one of the highest inflation rates in several years now. Fuel costs are about 200 rupees NC at the moment. And a lot of it can be sort of attributed to COVID supply shocks, yes, but to me, it seems the primary cause is the Ukraine war and the ensuing inflationary pressures. So what has happened is that the central bank now has tightened the monetary policy. Banks have limited loan outflows now, and land transactions, which is usually one of the highest, let's say, assets or the most preferred asset in the country, transactions are now at an all-time low. And import bans have also been in place to reduce these foreign exchange outflows. So on the whole, the economy is not in as bad a shape as, let's say, a Sri Lanka. But if we continue down the road of economic mismanagement, of fiscal mismanagement, then those signs will be, let's say, more alarming. What's encouraging, though, is that tourism has slowly been picking up post the pandemic. It's still not come back to pre-pandemic levels. But tourists are returning to the country. Tourism spending, however, has declined per day on a per day basis. So hopefully we will see an improvement in that. Remittances have also started picking up once again because more and more migrant labor have been going out to countries after the pandemic, let's say, restrictions have been, let's say, reduced. There have been new labor agreements with Japan and Qatar. So on the whole, I think there are some encouraging signs, but there are also some signs that Nepal as an economy will need to watch out for. And I think those will be the key in the years to come, or rather in the next, let's say, 10 to 15 months, what's going to happen. So,
yeah, but in the sense that you spoke about the Ukraine war seems to be continuing, and the global uncertainty, global turmoil is not ending with the Taiwan crisis recently. How do you see Nepal coping up with these new curveballs that are being thrown up globally?
That's the thing, right? Like, I mean, Nepal's always been an import-dependent country. And what's happened is that inflation, because of these, let's say, curveballs, as you're saying, these global, let's say, supply shocks, the cost of imports have been rising. And that is the major worry. So one of the things that the country has recently done is to sort of put restrictions on luxury imports, let's say like vehicles, mobile phones worth about $300, and even some in form of, let's say, like domestic industry protection to ban imports of FMCG goods, to ban imported tobacco. So I think the first signs that we will see will be more restrictions on imports on, let's say, these luxury goods if things go worse from here. The other thing is, tourism will have to pick up. that is the big earner. That is the big, let's say, that is where a lot of our forex comes from. Our remittances, yes, they will. We will hopefully see a rise from here on because there is increasing labor demand. But again, like I said, these a lot of these economic supply shocks are also unpredictable in a larger way, especially for smaller countries like ours, where it's dependent on a few sectors. So the country will need to watch what it's spending on, what it's, let's say, saving upon, where the foreign exchange can come from. These will be the factors, I suppose, which will determine the economy in the months to come.
The political situation in Nepal also seems rather fractious. How do you explain this political situation to an outside observer who has not really followed it closely?
I have a friend. He has an analogy, very very interesting analogy that I want to borrow here. So post civil war politics in Nepal, post or Republican politics here in Nepal, what's it emerged as basically there are 15 men who control Nepali politics, and whenever 9 of them come together, they form a government, while the other 6 try new alignments or new formations to topple the government and form their own. So that is essentially the sort of these 15 men that Nepali politics revolves around. So right now, what we have is we have a ruling coalition that is made up of Nepali Congress. We have the Maoists. We have a breakaway faction of the UML. Under the UML is a party, the chief opposition party led by former Prime Minister KP Oli, and a few more parties. We also have elections coming up in November. The ruling coalition has decided to go in as an electoral coalition as well. So right now, seat sharing arrangements are under discussion. But essentially, election season is now underway, and we will see new, let's say, dynamics, new political alignments, and going by the results of the local elections in May, perhaps even new, let's say, faces in parliament, new independent candidates in parliament. Let's see.
What did the local elections throw up, and is the situation different in provinces compared to what we see in Kathmandu?
See, what the local elections reaffirmed were that there are 2, I would say, broadly pan-Nepal parties, which is the Nepali Congress and the UML, and the results of the local elections also tell us that in the general elections in November, one of these 2 parties will probably come either first or second. They will be essentially doing that, right? So that is number one. The second thing that the local elections threw up in terms of results was that there is also a hunger in the Nepali, let's say, polling, the voting population for alternate candidates. We had quite a few independent candidates who won in as mayors, candidates who were not backed by any political parties, candidates who came up as local activists, fighting on local issues like drinking water. So we've had these sort of results also come up in the local elections. So what that tells us is there is a possibility that more and more independent candidates will throw in their hats in the ring in the general elections. We have had a couple who've already announced the candidacies, and if, let's say, the voting population can, let's say, identify with the calls or the electoral, let's say, manifestos of these candidates, it is highly possible that they may choose such candidates against the established parties. So that is one trend that I would really watch out for.
Amish, after a couple of years of the pandemic, and which has affected all countries in South Asia, in fact, globally very badly, how are these social indicators in Nepal holding up? I'm talking about health, education. How are they holding up? This situation was always very tough in Nepal because of the kind of geography that you have, and the economic standing, economic status that you have.
So what's happened is that a lot of our budget, right, social, let's say, infrastructure budget, has been diverted towards COVID management. So while COVID vaccination rates are pretty healthy, actually, the booster rates not so much, but the COVID vaccination, the first and second doses are pretty healthy in South Asia. Other health indicators such as maternal mortality, children's vaccination programs, they have been affected badly, right? And schools and colleges were closed during the pandemic, so that has obviously affected education, especially since outside of cities, we don't have online learning opportunities. So because the budget allocations were diverted towards COVID management, that ate up a large chunk of our resources. Now, what's happening is that in cities like Kathmandu right now, we're also facing a triple whammy. We've right now having a BA5 COVID wave. We've got dengue right now, and we've got cholera. There are reports of swine flu also. There are, and suddenly in the middle there were sort of like rumors of monkeypox as well. So I think what COVID has done is that while a lot of the, let's say, focus has been on COVID, on, let's say, vaccination programs, these other elements that make up, let's say, larger social infrastructure, that those have been lagging behind. And I think increasingly that will also be a choice for Nepal to make as to how much to dedicate towards COVID and how much to dedicate towards continuing these other health and education programs that are already ongoing.
And how will Nepal make up for these losses in education, in health? Because, clearly 2 years is a big loss in terms of education, especially primary education in tough areas. India is facing the same situation. India is facing the same crisis. And this has been one big issue, which we really don't know what the answer is going to be. For people who are in class 3 or 4, do you really, promote them to class 5? What do you do with those class 3 and 4 education levels? How do they overcome that? Even for health, as you mentioned, the fact that vaccination inoculation rates have really gone down for all the other diseases. What do you do with that? Health parameters have shrunk. What do you do with that? How is Nepal going? How do you think Nepal is going to tackle those kind of challenges?
My sense is that this is where multilateral institutions will have to step in and, let's say, adjust policies, adjust programs, and expand their, let's say, like outreach as well. Because a lot of our social infrastructure, a lot of our vaccination programs, and education programs have been conducted in tandem with multilateral, let's say, agencies, right? Like UNICEF, like UN-based agencies. So I think one way would be to expand the outreach over there. The other is also to think about this is also a good chance to think about, all right, can we use this let's say break, can we use this, let's say, sort of like interruption that has emerged to rethink our education policies, to rethink, let's say, how do you deliver quality education to, let's say, schools, government schools, particularly outside of urban centers? Because that's one of the challenges that COVID threw up. And that will be, again, without the help of multilateral agencies, without the help of, let's say, bilateral institutions, I don't think Nepal can do it on its own. It's social, let's say, the way these programs have been structured, the way these, let's say, programs have been budgeted, they require the intervention of other agencies to actually make that effort. And one, let's say, result that we saw, for example, in the past 2 years is that malnutrition rates in the far west districts that are bordering Kumaon, that side, they have been rising, especially among children, because these nutrition programs were being funded by WFP, were being funded by FAO, and these programs have been obviously severely impacted because of the pandemic. So I think it will be a tough couple of years for sure.
Let me come to the big issue which animates everybody in South Asia when they talk of Nepal, particularly in India. For someone who's really not aware of the details, can you explain the two agreements with the United States that have become so controversial in Nepal? And what really is the issue with these two agreements?
Okay, there are two programs. One was the MCC, the other was the State Partnership Program. The MCC is a treaty that was signed in 2017. It is essentially a Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact, under which the US grants a developing economy a certain sum of money for physical infrastructure development. So in Nepal's case, the US will give Nepal about 500 million USD to develop electricity transmission lines and maintain and upgrade existing highways. So on the face of it, it is a non-controversial sort of an idea. It became controversial because it became to be associated with the Indo-Pacific strategy. First, I think Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State when he associated the MCC with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So then it began to be seen in Nepal as an American tool to contain China. And its association with the military component began to worry Nepali leaders. A lot of the opposition was also based on misinformation. The Americans alleged that it was disinformation that was funded by the Chinese. around the MCC. So there were social media videos that said that passing the MCC would allow American troops to enter Nepal and so on and so forth. And the Americans obviously, like denied all of this. The Nepali leaders also who were on favor of the MCC said no such thing was going to happen. But what we saw was that there was active Chinese interest in not allowing the MCC to be ratified by Parliament. We saw it in its foreign ministry statements. They said, I believe, they gave at least 3 comments on the MCC before the MCC was ratified. So the MCC essentially became a front for the global US-China contest. And ultimately, it was ratified in Parliament despite massive public protests. So one could argue that the limits of Chinese influence could be seen in Nepal through the ratification of MCC. Now, the State Partnership Program, this is a different agreement. This one would allow the US National Guard to train with and train the Nepal army in sort of various, let's say, like disaster management programs, post-earthquake relief efforts. But what happened was that the American insistence on SPP coming so soon after MCC ratification began to intensify the views, it cemented the views of anti-MCC leaders who argued that Nepal was being dragged into this US-China contest. So when the Americans said that Nepal had already asked to be signed up to SPP, the Nepal army actually refuted such claims. Then a letter from 2015 leaked to the press suggested that the then army chief had actually requested Nepal to be part of SPP. So eventually, like what happened was that despite American statements that the SPP is not a military alliance, Nepali lawmakers at the moment have refused to go ahead with any agreements, right? So both of these controversies essentially center around a couple of arguments. That Nepal is a non-aligned state by its foreign policy, and thus it will not be seen taking any sides with any global power, although it is open to aid from all. And that the US must not drag Nepal into its global contest with China, which is a friendly neighbor. But what the controversies also told us was that it showed a very Nepali tendency to critique or negate agreements after they have been signed, which did not make for good optics. Another fact of these, let's say, what these controversies threw up was that smaller countries like Nepal will become a site for US-China tussle in the future, which does not bode very well for countries like us at all.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah. But what is the status of relationship with China? Nepalese foreign minister really met Wang Yi, his Chinese counterpart, and they issued a very strong statement as well. Just after this controversy with over these 2 agreements with the United States, is the relationship with China again picking up, or are the Chinese still seem to be angry with Nepal?
I would say it's definitely not as cozy as it was when the communists were unified under Oli. But it seems that the Chinese have recently begun to reach out to all political actors once more. The commonly held belief is that the Chinese would like to see all communist actors to unite once again, either before or after the elections. They have shown a preference in Nepali politics, which one can argue is not always a smart choice in a fractious polity like Nepal. But they now seem to be mending fences with the Congress. They're definitely more outspoken about their interests in Nepal today than even before the pandemic. So that there are some significant shifts in that manner. But on the other fronts, there hasn't been any movement on any of the BRI listed projects. The recent announcement also to study the Tibet-Nepal train line is also not the first time that such a, let's say, study has been announced, right? So it has been announced a couple of times earlier. Some infrastructure works are being ready. For example, the Pokhara International Airport, for which Nepal is a Chinese contractor is building it under a Chinese loan, a Chinese Exim Bank loan. So that should be ready by, I think, December, and I think it will come into operation by January next year. Land borders and trade, however, have suffered both due to China's zero COVID policy. What has also happened is that China has unilaterally controlled border movement and transit. So Nepalese have been really, let's say, not being able to import goods from the land borders at all. And even now, the land borders have been shut down because of COVID cases rising in Tibet. So that's still happening. And China, the other thing is that Chinese tourists have not returned. So that is a big loss to the Nepali tourism market. They were the second largest, let's say, tourism market after India. And a lot of the Nepali, let's say, tourism economy had reoriented itself around Chinese group tourists. Like a lot, like essentially Chinese tour travel in groups, right? And Nepali, let's say there were a lot new restaurants, there were a lot new hotels, travel agencies that have come up who were catering to Chinese group tours, but they haven't returned. So that's been a big loss to the market right now.
And Amish, what are the drivers for this relationship, Nepal-China relationship, which have not altered despite change in politics, despite COVID? What are the major drivers or the big driver, if there's only one of this relationship?
See, I would argue there are a couple of facets to the relationship, right? The first is that Nepal is an immediate neighboring country. So that, and it is a neighboring country with which China has had a long bilateral relationship post, let's say, the PRC. And Nepal has always consistently been in support of the One China policy. Nepal has consistently sided with China at international forums. So there is a sense that the Chinese value Nepalese support. So that is one. The second is the long Himalayan border and the association, the historical, let's say, links with Tibet and the presence of a large number of Tibetan exiles here in Nepal, the sort of political activism that we saw in the run up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. So that is obviously a major concern for the Chinese as well, and that to a large extent. Tibetan exiles, the political activism has been obviously totally, it's now down pretty much to zero. But that larger concern about Tibetan exiles here in Nepal, and with increasing, let's say, US attention now on Tibet once again, that concern is obviously there. The third is, I would say, the Chinese also are now, as in the rest of South Asia, they're also expanding upon their influence. They're sort of more assertive. They are more voluble about what matters to them, how they would like countries to, let's say, associate with them or with their narratives. So I think with that, China is, and I think it was in 2013 when Xi Jinping started his neighborhood policy. And since then, China has emphasized or made clear what it would like to see in Nepal. And as I earlier said, it has made its preference in Nepali polity very clear. It prefers the communists to be in power. And whether that's a smart choice or not, one can always argue about that. But China, even before 2015, it would not do that in Nepal. So those sort of, there are sort of historical trajectories that have been on the change, that have been, let's say, evolving. But again, as the US-China contest sharpens, what Nepal's choices will be in the years to come, these will be the, let's say, determinants of, and of course, the India factor is massive, right? The idea that, all right, we know that India has always had a special relationship in Nepal. India's political and economic influences obviously unparalleled, but an erosion of Indian influence, or rather China gaining influence, will always be at the cost of erosion of Indian influence. No? So these factors will always be there. And I think from here on, let's say, how the India-China relationship shapes up, how the US-China relationship or the contest will go on from here on, that will also determine how China looks at Nepal from here on.
Amish, I have seen some attention in the media, particularly because of this security agreement being focused on the Nepal army as well. Has the increase in the strength of Nepal army and its role in the democratic setup changed the political landscape in some manner? I'm talking in terms of civil-military relations, in terms of how the Nepalese army now operates with this form of government.
Not really. What has happened is that the army has continued to retain its status as a permanent establishment inside Nepal. So, it's in terms of civil-military relations, it's quite that demarcation has been quite evident, and it is not, let's say, the army has not been dragged into politics the way it once was in around 2009, after Prajanda sort of tried to drag the army chief into controversy. So that hasn't happened at all. What has definitely happened is that the Nepal army has begun to expand into civil works, into infrastructure contracts. So which have also allowed new criticisms to be directed against it, such as in land acquisition or let's say in terms of road expansion, right? So its recent gaffes during the SPP controversy also showed that the army is also not immune to the larger incompetence, that sort of like pervades the Nepali state and its actors, right? So, but whether it has become more democratic in the Republic Nepal, I cannot say. It is certainly not more transparent. That is certain. Its size had also ballooned during the civil war. So there haven't been any discussions as of yet whether its numbers have to be brought down or not. But on the whole, I would say relations between the army and the civilian side of, let's say, the institutions or state institutions, they have been pretty, let's say, comfortable. They have been pretty, let's say, regular, and the transition between army chiefs has also been very, very, let's say, like encouraging. But like I said, like I mean, the army is also expanding upon its role. So let's see how it goes from here.
Like other countries in South Asia, I'm particularly referring to India. Is nationalism also a growing issue in Nepal? Is it becoming a problematic issue, or is it something which is still under the radar, not really something you're concerned about?
I would say nationalism has always been an issue in Nepal. I mean, much longer prior to how, let's say, before it happened in India as well. I mean, Nepali nationalism is very, very curious in that my sort of point of view in this is that it derives its logic from an essentially anti-Indian perspective, in that it sort of argues that India does not have Nepal's best interests at heart. And I think that is something that we will, let's say, as elections come up, like as politicians want to carry a point with their voters, they will say things that will affect this larger bilateral relationship with India. For example, recently, former Prime Minister Oli said he had to step down because of the map, and he was essentially alluding to the fact that, all right, the map, because I issued this new Nepal map, I had to step down, I had to resign as Prime Minister, and things like that. I mean, these allusions, these sort of like references will be more blatant as the elections come up. So that is one. The second is Nepali nationalism is also very different from, let's say, the Hindutva brand of nationalism that we see in India today. It is more to do with, let's say, national integrity, on sovereignty, on the question of let's say territorial sovereignty, the question of, let's say, territorial the question of the Kalapani territory, right, where Nepal argues that land has always belonged to Nepal, and that is a line that most nationalists will follow, and they will not so there will be some sort of a, let's say, within Nepali nationalism, you will see convergences along these lines. It will be anti-Indian to begin with. It will argue on territorial sovereignty. It will argue on, let's say, national integrity, and it will argue on who or what exactly constitutes a Nepali. So you have the Nepali language at its core, you have the Nepali hill population at its core. So these are some of the commonalities of Nepali nationalism, which I would say have lasted longer than, or have existed before the Hindutva movement as well. So
Amish, and how does, because you mentioned India and at the core of what lies at the core of Nepalese nationalism, how does today's India look from Nepal?
India is in an interesting spot right now. I mean, the memories of the 2015 blockade are very evident. I mean, they haven't, let's say, been gone at all. But there has also been a significant shift in Indian policy towards Nepal since then. Delhi is definitely less visible in day-to-day political affairs, and it is instant that the emphasis has been a lot more on connectivity, and it's not just infrastructure or economic, but its emphasis on religious and cultural connectivity, as we saw during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Lumbini, and he is the first Indian Prime Minister to visit two border towns. So that sort of emphasis on connectivity going beyond, let's say, shared culture, shared religions, that is very, very evident. What's also happened is that the increasing Chinese visibility in Nepali political affairs has benefited Delhi. So has the US-China tussle itself, right? There have been new hydro and power purchase agreements that have solidified India's role, let's say India's economic role in Nepal. But then there's the flip side. The flip side is that the map controversy remains a bilateral irritant. Nepal's demands to make public the EPG recommendations, the Eminent Persons Group recommendations, and amend the 1950 treaty have also been constant. And there are some smaller irritants which can easily be resolved, such as new air corridors to incoming flights to Nepal, right? Others, like the map, the treaty, these will require they'll require a franker, the more open dialogue from both sides, which does not yet seem forthcoming. There are rumors, the rumors are quite right, that the BJP RSS government in India would like to see a return of the Hindu state here in Nepal, which has encouraged right-wing practitioners here in the country, right-wing parties here in the country. They have been demanding more of a return to the Hindu state. The influx of Hindutva from the bordering states of UP and Bihar is also very real. So I think as is, always in India-Nepal relations, it's a sort of you cannot sort of define it within a particular, let's say, corridor or a particular, let's say, subject. It is widespread, it is sort of intricate, and all these sort of issues have been coming up or have been resolved. Like I said, these new power purchase agreements are actually benefiting Nepal tremendously, especially in this last year. I just read recently that Nepal had managed to sell quite a bit of electricity to India in this past monsoons. And I think the more this sort of economic connectivity comes up, the more, let's say, India shifts back from this political discourse, from the, let's say, being a political actor in Nepal. I think the more its other, let's say, policy shifts will become more significant to the public.
And Amish, let me put the question differently to you. When you look at India, what thought comes to your mind now?
India is in an interesting place in the neighborhood right now from where I am in Nepal, right? As a democracy, it is troubling. The rise of, let's say, Hindu majoritarianism, it has been troubling since 2014 itself, but since 2019, it's obviously become a lot more, let's say, acerbic. It's become a lot more sharper. So that is obviously worrying. But at the same time, India's policy, let's say, the way it's conducting its foreign policy, especially in the neighborhood, it's sort of, like I said, it's withdrawal from the political management, right? And its emphasis on these larger connectivity issues, these larger economic issues. I think that bodes much better for foreign policy as a whole, So both, I would say, to be, let's say, from a Nepali perspective, you're looking at Indian, let's say, domestic affairs. You're looking at, let's say, the rise of Hindutva, the rise. Just today there was some concept of a Hindu state that came up, and you sort of think that, all right, does India really need to be doing all of this? When it can, it can do a lot more, right? But to focus on these narrow, let's say, interests, to focus on these narrow majoritarian ideas, it just seems to be, let's say, putting India on the back burner itself, rather than allowing India to grow into, let's say, this mature democracy that it should really have been in South Asia.
And Amish, one final question: what's the next book project that you are working on, and when does it come out?
Not immediately yet. Not immediately. It's more of a time to reflect. There are some interesting ideas that are floating about, but I haven't really fixed upon anything yet. But hopefully soon.
Yeah, hopefully soon, and we look forward to your next book and to your writings. As always, it was a pleasure talking to you, Amish.
Thank you, Sushant. Thank you so much for this.
To our listeners, thank you for listening. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.